It is a pleasure to be here with you this morning. I see lots of familiar faces, which is really heartwarming because I lived in Washington, D.C. from 2012 to 2016 as one of the professional countertenor singers at the Washington National Cathedral. For those of you unfamiliar with the term countertenor, it is a male alto or male soprano. So if today is your first encounter with the voice type, I hope to do it justice while singing some songs for you in service. I'm told that one of my first acts of ministry was actually through art, and so it's happy for me to be here singing for you today. That first act of ministry was as a child in the back pew, growing up listening to my father preach, who was a campus pastor. And while he was giving the homily, I took a marker and drew on the carpet all the way from the back pew up to the front pew where he was. So I'm so thankful to be here with you today, and you should be very thankful that there's no carpet in this sanctuary. Now, the other reason I'm here also has to do with my father. He spent the bulk of his career at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln as a campus pastor, a Lutheran campus pastor. And when I was 19 years old, he passed away from esophageal cancer. Now, for a good Midwestern Lutheran who had already started saving for my retirement in high school, my dad's death changed everything. He was 58 at the time of his passing, and I had spent my whole life being told that you go to school, you grow up, you go to college, you meet your spouse, you get a job, and then when you turn 65, you get to do all those things you've been dreaming about your whole life. And yet, with my dad's passing at 58, I saw him lose out on that. And so, Pastor, you can tell me if this is a common backup career or not for ministers, but my dad often said if he hadn't been a pastor, he probably would have been a trucker. I don't know if it was the unlimited amount of sunflower seeds he was allowed to eat, the wind in his hair, or just the really bad late-night talk radio, but my dad loved to drive. And so as a 19-year-old having my first experience with the death of someone close to me, I had absolutely no idea how to grieve. And so I climbed in my dad's car and took my first ever adult independent road trip just 10 days after his funeral to the glamorous locations of Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Rochester, Minnesota. And while the locations might not have been glamorous by typical standards, for me, especially looking back, it was exactly what I needed to process his death. It took me from a town that had been nothing but cancer and chemo treatments for 3 years and put me in a different physical space that allowed God to enter my heart and mind in ways that I was not letting it happen in my hometown. One of the lessons I learned on this journey was that indeed life is short, whether it's our dreams for retirement, our goals for our life, or spending time with the people we care about. We are not guaranteed all the time that we might think we'll get. And so I made it a goal that after that first year at age 19, for the rest of my life, I would do a road trip around the time of my father's passing as a way to honor the road trips in life that he didn't get, but also to try and honor the road trips in life that I might not get if I pass away young as he did. As these road trips started to expand a little bit further beyond Sioux Falls and Rochester, I started meeting people older and much wiser than I. And as I spoke to them about my road trips, they affirmed this lesson that I had learned, that life is short. Tomorrow's not guaranteed, and we don't always get the time to do the things we dream about or to spend with the people we care about. So while my elders knew this lesson, I realized something interesting about my generation. Everyone in our 20s seemed to think that we were going to live forever, or at least until 80. And so, as I drove around the country, I started realizing that this was a message that maybe I needed to take to my peers. And so throughout my 20s, I started making it a goal that when I turned 30, I would do something crazy. Something to somehow share this message with my generation and everyone in a way that was less hard than I had to learn it. So at age 30, I packed up the majority of my belongings and put them in storage in my pastor's house and put everything else I owned into a white windowless cargo van and committed to living in that van for 3 years as I drove around America and attempted to set a world record as the youngest person to visit all 417 U.S. National Park Service sites. I'm happy to share that having launched this journey about 16 months ago on April 29th, 2016, the 11th anniversary of my father's passing, I am now almost 2/3 done with this journey, having visited 271 of the 417 sites. I'm also happy to share that my goal of spreading this message, this lesson that life is short, tomorrow's not guaranteed, has been a successful one, in that in the 16 months of this road trip, I've done over 400 pieces of media from my home state of Nebraska to New Zealand, sharing this message that life is short, tomorrow's not guaranteed, and we should appreciate time and people while we have them. Now, 19 was a big year for me. Not only was it the year I lost my father, but when I was 19, it was the first time in my life that I met an openly gay adult. Growing up as the pastor's kid in Nebraska, my understanding of the LGBT community came solely through what I saw in the media, which taught me 3 things. Number 1, all gay men grow up to become drag queens. Number 2, the LGBT community spends the entire year trying to figure out how to wear as little clothes as possible on a float downtown. And the one message that I got loudest and clearest was that anyone who was LGBT was going to hell. And there was nothing they could do about it. So, with these stereotypes in mind, imagine my surprise when I show up to my first day of college choir and I meet my choir director, who I found out was gay. And not only was he not a drag queen, but he was wearing lots of clothes, and he drove a Lexus convertible, which didn't sound like a deviant to me. And so, as I started meeting more and more LGBT people and having my stereotypes changed, I started to look closer at the Bible and this message that I'd been told my whole life, that LGBT people were doomed to hell. Now, this isn't a message that I got so much directly from my church, but like good Lutherans, I got it by omission. At least in the Midwest, if there are things that make us uncomfortable, we don't talk about them. And so we could talk about so-and-so who got a divorce, we could talk about so-and-so who was drinking too much, but we never talked about LGBT people. So I knew that it was really bad. But despite that, I started looking at Scripture, and I was reading books and taking in media that talked about the Bible in different ways and reading Scripture in different ways. And after years of wrestling with these questions, I realized not only could LGBT people go to heaven, but that I was gay, and that I hadn't chosen it, and there was nothing I could do, despite decades of praying, to change it. Coming to this realization in my early 20s, I thought, well, I don't really see a lot of people living, balancing both of these parts of themselves. Going to school in Memphis, Tennessee, the 2 main examples that I saw were people who spent their life figuring out who they were. They came out of the closet, and then the church told them, you can't be that and part of us. And so they would go to one extreme, and they would say, if I can't be part of you, then I'm going to abandon everything you've ever told me and do the opposite. Then I saw another group that said, well, I know I'm a Christian, first and foremost, and I know this other part about myself, but the church tells me I can't be both, so I'm going to stay in the closet and marry somebody of the opposite gender. And here I was stuck in the middle, knowing from my childhood, my life, that I was a Christian, but also spending 2 decades to figure out this other part. And so I thought, I cannot be the only one. And so I started having a secondary mission for my annual road trips. And that was that I was going to find some gay Christians. Now, before I say this next part, I just want to preface it by saying there's absolutely nothing wrong with being in your 50s, 60s, or 70s. However, as I drove around the country on my road trips, all the LGBT Christians that I met were in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. Now, once again, there's nothing wrong with that. But there's an amazing quote by civil rights leader Meyer who says, "It's hard to be what you can't see." And as a mid-20-something gay Christian, I was really struggling to be what I wasn't seeing. I didn't see any peers, people who were like me in the church. And so when I moved to Washington, D.C. at age 26, I thought, if I traveled all around the country and I can't find these LGBT Christians, maybe I can bring them to me. Being the amazing city that Washington, D.C. is, and having people from all over the country and world, wouldn't you know that they were here? And so from age 26, starting a group called Queer for Christ, which was specifically reaching out to young adult LGBT Christians. I'm happy to share that by the time I reached age 30 and left on this road trip, that group had become the largest regular gathering of young adult LGBT Christians in the world. Now, you all know this, but because of the diversity of the city, that meant that I was meeting people from my home state of Nebraska and Florida and Washington State. But I was also meeting people from Indonesia and China and Hungary, and people who were Lutheran, who were Methodist, who were Episcopalian, who were Pentecostal, who were African Methodist Episcopal, who were Quaker, who were Mormon. People of all backgrounds came to this group. And yet the most fascinating thing was we all shared one thing. And their stories reflected my story. That I grew up feeling unwanted by my church. I grew up feeling unwanted by my faith. And I grew up feeling unwanted by my God. Now, for those of you who aren't aware, this year that we're in right now is the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Being a good Lutheran, I heard a lot about Martin Luther growing up, and one of the things we talked about was his lightning bolt moment. His reluctantness to become a priest, and God sort of saying, I know you don't feel ready for this, I know you don't think you're qualified, I know you don't think you should do this, but buckle in. And so it's been interesting now that I'm halfway through this road trip, and that during this 500th anniversary of the Reformation, God has given me my own lightning bolt. When I started this journey, I realized very quickly that there were not many LGBT people in the outdoors arena. And that there also weren't a lot of gay Christians out in the media. So that I had better hide that part about myself if I wanted to have any chance at being successful with getting my original message out or finishing this journey. But God, much like Martin Luther in a lightning bolt, sent me my own lightning bolt. And it came in the form, as is 2017, of an Instagram message. And it was from a 15-year-old in Texas who said, "Hi, I go to a private Baptist high school in Texas. I heard about your journey and I saw about your group. And I just wanted to thank you because now I know not only can I be ordinary, but I can be extraordinary." And when you get a message like that, it sort of changes you and that you forget all about your personal fears about what will the world think of me, what will my labels do to what I'm trying to create. And you realize that sometimes God calls us to bigger missions. And so I realized that God was calling me to be a light in the darkness for people like myself who grow up not seeing themselves and were having a really hard time being themselves. And so I committed that every interview I did from then on, the average of 3 I was getting per week, not only would I mention that I was gay, to help break these stereotypes that we don't like the outdoors, but also I would mention that I was a gay Christian. So that whether in my home state of Nebraska or somewhere around the world, someone seeing that media piece could know that even if their culture, if their town, if their church told them that there wasn't a place for them in God's kingdom, that somewhere there was someone who reconciled. Somewhere there was a church and a God that wanted them. Interestingly enough, around the same time I started doing this, I started running out of money on my journey and was going to have to quit. And so a friend said, well, Micah, you've spent the last decade as a professional singer. Why don't you sing along the way? And so I called a friend who was a priest in Florida, and I said, hey, I'm coming down in a month. Do you want me to sing for your church? He said, of course. We'll put out a basket for you, and we'll keep you on the road. And so I show up that morning to the church service, and he said, yeah, so I'm going to get up for the sermon, say a little bit, and then introduce you and let you finish. What? He said, yeah, you'll be great. Just, tell them about what you're doing and mix it into the gospel somehow and, send a good message. It's really easy. I'm thinking, are you crazy? I think actually he was just out really late the night before and didn't write a sermon. He thought this was an easy out, blame it on the guest. But what was amazing is that I started telling my journey and my story. I heard from people in the sanctuary that this was one of the first times they'd heard their story from the pulpit. They had felt recognized. And so I added to my journey not only to use the media, but to visit churches all around the country and share a message that I really needed as a 10-year-old. I'm happy to state that in 2017, I've been to 43 different churches around the country. Some of them are open and affirming, and it's an opportunity to advertise to the local LGBT community that there is a church in their town, even if theirs doesn't want them, that does want them. Some churches say to me, we want you to speak to our congregation because we haven't voted yet on if we're going to perform same-sex weddings. And when we do, I want them to think of someone. No pressure. And then some of my favorite churches, one in particular, the pastor said, you know what, I'm retiring next year, so you say whatever you want. But it's been incredible to see the way that God has used this national parks journey to be a light in the darkness for people who needed it, and to show me that there were parts of myself and things that I was afraid of that I thought I had to hide to fit into God's kingdom that could be used for God's work. Now, as I mentioned, one of the ways I stay on the road is by singing for myself at churches along the way. So if it is on your heart, there is a box in the back outside of the sanctuary. And if you'd like to support this ministry, you're welcome to. If you'd like to come along on the journey with me, the van is small and doesn't fit that many people, but there are cards back there, and whether through social media or email lists or my blog, you can see the entirety of America from the smartphone in your palm. And lastly, if you have any questions, whether about being a male soprano or living in a van or the parks or a gay Christian, I'll be out back afterwards and happy to chat with you. But if there's one thing I can leave you with today, it's a strong gospel message. Being a campus pastor, my dad always said to his interns who would come for a year from seminary that when you're a campus pastor, people might come to church that Sunday for the first time and only time they're going to in college. Their parents aren't there to force them, so maybe they did bad on a test, maybe they got broken up with, but for whatever reason, they're going to come to church on this one Sunday, and if you don't have a strong gospel message, they might never come back. So if this is your one Sunday in church, the one message I want to leave you with is one that I've learned while driving around the country these past 16 months. As I'm sure we're all aware here in Washington, D.C., one of the things we like to talk about is how different we are in America, how divided we are, how we have red states and blue states, rural voters and urban voters, rich and poor, etc. You pick the ways in which we are told we are divided and we cannot come together. But as I drive around the country, it's very interesting for me to hear this because I see so much commonality among all of us. No matter what labels are put on us, I see a humanity, no matter who they voted for, no matter what taxes they pay, that all yearns for one thing. They desire to love and to be loved. Now, the theologian in me would say that this is mankind's reaching out for God's love and the desire to be loved by God and to love God in return. And so when I look at the Bible, the way that God has shown us to bring that love, that heaven to earth, I see some really practical examples that talk to what we're going through today. You know, we have people who are others, who are different, who we're told that we just can't get along with. And Jesus had those in Jesus' time too. We had the woman at the well, who maybe by modern standards is our friend, who makes some people uncomfortable, and so we don't want to be seen with them. And, you know, it would bring down our reputation. And so, like this woman at the well, who perhaps came to get her water at a time when the rest of the women of town were not there so as not to be shamed, was at this well as an outcast. And yet we see Jesus come to her and not only interact with her, but do so treating her first and foremost not as her earthly labels, but as a child of God. In the same instance, we see Jesus with the blind man come across someone who popular culture of the day, those days' earthly labels would say was blind because he sinned or his parents sinned. And if we get too close or interact with him, we might catch that sin and become blind too. But yet Jesus, once again, not only interacts with this man, but does so warmly and treats the blind man first and foremost as a child of God, not by his earthly labels. And perhaps the most stunning example of Jesus' reaching out to all while he is hanging on the cross, he looks to his side and does not see a criminal as the earth labeled him, but sees a child of God and says, "You will be welcome by my side in heaven." And so my challenge for all of us, myself included, I'm no holier than thou. I struggle too. But my challenge for us is that as we leave God's house and go out into the world, that we treat people as God taught us through Jesus. That whether it's someone of a different race, of a different socioeconomic status, of a different political affiliation, or even our neighbor who just plays the music too loud and it's really annoying, that we remember to treat one another not by our earthly labels, but to treat each other first and foremost as Jesus would treat us, as children of God, worthy of God's love, and worthy of being loved and looked at beyond those earthly labels. Now, if you are hearing this today and you think, well, I am that different person, I'm one of those labels that the world looks at me oddly, take heart. Because in the story of the blind man in John 9, 1 through 41, the people ask Jesus, they say, "Rabbi, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind?" And Jesus replies to them, "Neither this man nor his parents sinned. This man was born blind so that God's works might be revealed through him." So whether you're the gay child of a well-known pastor and wondering if maybe God made you gay so that people who wouldn't hear a message of acceptance without it being attached to someone they respect could suddenly hear it, or whatever your label is, whatever your difference is that the world tells you should make you unworthy and make you feel less than, I'm here to remind you that through the Bible, through God's example, through Jesus' example, we are told that our differences, the things that people tell us to be ashamed of, that make us unworthy, are the exact opposite. Our differences, those things that make us unique, are holy and can be used so that God's works might be revealed through us. Amen.
For he is king.
you.